am from.
While you all are making your way to your seats, I'll do some information. These are housekeeping bits. I hope that you all have had a wonderful second day of HASTAC 2015. I have certainly enjoyed my day. We have a few more things in store for you today. Aside from the wonderful talk that we're about to hear, we have a poster session and reception immediately following. So we will continue to feed you as much as we possibly can. And there will also be a cash bar at that event. So it'll be a nice poster session. That will be in the Lincoln Room, which is the round room at the end of the hallway on the other side of the building. On your way there, here's what you might want to do, because it will be your last chance. Buy a t-shirt or mug emblazoned with the lovely logos and mission patch image to take home for yourself, for a loved one, for a mentor, for a mentee, anyone really. It will be the last chance. They're going to load out all of the stuff out of the registration area while the poster session is going on. So do drop by and take one of those home. Otherwise, Dean will have to keep a box for himself, which he's desperately wanting to do. We also have our Birds of a Feather dinners this evening. You are on your own for dinner. However, we've organized these lovely groups. There are some clipboards at the end of the registration table, and they have different restaurants and topics. You can choose based on either one. We won't judge you. If you can find a confluence, that's really good. Here's what we'll ask. Your meeting won't be necessarily here unless you would like to walk over. You'll actually meet at the restaurant at about 7 o'clock. There you should find someone who has agreed to be the discussion leader. If you're a discussion leader for one of the Birds of a Feather talks, stop by the table and grab one of the little tents or signs, and it says reserved for HASTAC. So you can put that on there, and that way people can find you. So grab one of those and then go to the restaurant and have discourse and delightful food. Okay, I think that's all of our announcements. I do have a couple of exciting bits of news. One of the nice things about hosting HASTAC is once we are done, we get to hand the mantle of excitement off to the next host. And in our case, we have a chance to announce not only the next site for HASTAC 2016, but also HASTAC 2017. So get your calendars ready. Here we go. HASTAC 2016 will be held March 9th through the 12th, 2016, on the campus of Arizona State University, where Michael Simeone will be a host. Is Michael here? There's Michael. He's your host. And that's coming up really, really fast, right? March. So watch your inboxes and your various news feeds for a CFP really fast and get those ideas in quickly. Then coming up in 2017, we're excited to say, they're going to switch to the fall. And from November 2nd to the 4th, November 2 through 4, 2017, HASTAC will be hosted on the campus of the University of Central Florida in lovely Orlando. And that's Bruce Jans, right over here. All right, thank you, Bruce. So we look forward to visiting those campuses at wonderful times of the year in each case, and we hope that everything goes really well for both. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our third plenary speaker is Roopika Risam, and we're really, really proud and excited to have her here. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. She is an assistant professor of English and English secondary education at Salem State University, and along with Dr. Adeline Coe, co-founder of the postcolonial Digital Humanities website and movement. The DH POCO project has transformed the conversation of DH for the better by challenging all of us to confront issues of race, gender, class, and sexuality within and across cultures of technology. Dr. Risam is a prolific producer of digital work and work about digital cultures. If you haven't seen her open source digital edition of Claude McKay's Harlem Shadows, co-produced with Chris Forrester, you should definitely have a look at that. It's a wonderful piece. And she's currently finishing a book project titled Postcolonial Digital Humanities that you should all watch for very soon from Northwestern University Press. You can find her work online at places like First Monday, and she blogs at other sites like Jacket 2, and on her own site at roopikarisam.com. The range and depth of her scholarship and leadership are truly impressive, and I feel very fortunate to hear her speak today with us at HASTAC 2015. She will be presenting Across Two Imperial Cultures, a Ballad of Digital Humanities and the Global South. Please help me welcome Dr. Roopika Risam.
Thank you so much, Bill, for your introduction, and also to the conference organizers who invited me to speak this afternoon. I just have to say that HASTAC was a really important part of my intellectual formation. I was a HASTAC scholar as a graduate student at Emory and mentored by Brian Croxall, and so I feel especially honored to be here. And this has really been a tremendous conference. So could we please just take a moment to thank the program committee, Michigan State, and HASTAC for facilitating the rich conversations we've all had here. I'm going to begin my talk with two epigraphs which frame the intervention I wish to make. First, intellectuals, in particular literary intellectuals, are natural Luddites. That's C.P. Snow from 1959. And a little bit older, "O east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." That's from Rudyard Kipling in 1889. My talk moves in three parts. The first considers the construction of arts and sciences in relation to the crisis of the humanities in the US and abroad. The second contextualizes these concerns in relation to Snow's legacies and the digital humanities. And the third considers the global South within the digital humanities in light of these issues, asking after Kipling, might the twain meet? I don't need to tell you that public discourse about higher ed is grim. The class of 2015 just graduated with $56 billion in debt. The University of North Carolina just axed 46 programs, most from regional and historically black colleges and universities. Obama has made it clear that STEM and not the humanities are the future of the US workforce. The media and its pundits are deeply invested in narratives of the academy's implosion, and they have positioned themselves to police the crisis, as Stuart Hall would say. They inflame moral panic over higher ed, generating fodder for virtually endless op-eds for the Nicholas Kristofs and the Mark Bauerleins of the world. And I should tell you that Mark Bauerlein taught my pedagogy class in graduate school. So I'll leave that to your imagination. Conversations within the US Academy aren't more optimistic. Our enrollments are declining. The academic labor force is being casualized. Gen Ed programs aren't requiring literature and history courses. We perpetuate narratives of the crisis of the humanities, reflecting perceptions of a stark divide between the arts and the sciences. We only have to look at our own institutions to see the relative values accorded to STEM and the humanities. We may have found ourselves lamenting what seems to be a national shift away from the humanities and towards pre-professional tracks, or talking about the skill toolkits that demonstrate the utility of humanities majors, as though utility is derived from vocation alone. Or Perhaps we hear the phrase STEM to STEAM from our deans, like it's a lifeboat filled with engineers waiting to carry the artists to safety. But the real crisis of the humanities is that it's not a crisis, but a chronic condition. Early modernist Blaine Greitman has traced the roots of this crisis to Oxonian Robert Burton's 1621 remarks. In former times, kings, princes, emperors were the only scholars, excellent in all faculties. But those heroical times are past. The muses now are banished in this bastard age. I don't know about you, but I prefer the bastard age if it means that the knowledge isn't concentrated in the hands of power. That's just me. Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht ups the ante by arguing that the crisis of the humanities has existed as long as the humanities themselves, and that the humanities needs that crisis to survive. There's certainly a feature of US higher ed, the crisis of the humanities. Global dimensions are vexed. It's not an internationally translatable phenomenon. British scholar Andrew McRae has argued that it's not applicable in England, citing mitigating factors like lower cost education, earlier specialization, employer attitudes, and the research excellence framework, which assesses scholarly output and makes your British academic friends panic in December. Barbara Kem and Ludwika Risam, researchers in Scotland and the Netherlands, have suggested that the rhetoric of the crisis exists in Europe, and they attribute it to competition for funding, not less funding, just competition for the funding that exists, and to quality assessments like the REF. The idea of a crisis crops up elsewhere around the world, like in South Africa's 2011 report on the humanities, in which they described a crisis that sounds a lot like the US's and is attributed to post-apartheid governments' investment in STEM at the expense of the humanities. But that report was funded by the Ford Foundation. So perhaps the US's, one of their biggest exports is, in fact, the crisis of the humanities. I offer these examples not to make a grand claim about the crisis, or rather the condition of the humanities, but to illustrate the complex and pervasive gloom that seems to have settled on the humanities and has wide reach. It may, as Gumbrecht suggests, be the antithesis that the humanities needs to thrive. Or perhaps we've ousted Burton's muses prematurely. Yet my sense is our contemporary incarnation of the humanities and the fraught role of the digital humanities in it derives from C.P. Snow's specious depictions of the arts and sciences, which have instantiated a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom for the humanities. And I have to warn you, I don't have any answers, but I have a series of provocations. So while divisions between humanities and sciences have a longer history, amply illustrated by Scott Weingart yesterday, C.P. Snow's infamous lecture, Two Cultures in the Scientific Revolution, now 56 years ago, informed present anxieties over the crisis of the humanities. Snow argued that scientists and literary scholars constitute two groups, comparable in intelligence, identical in race, not grossly different in social origin, who had almost ceased to communicate at all, who are so radically different in intellectual, moral, and psychological climate. The literary intellectuals are largely to blame. They don't know the second law of thermodynamics. It's entropy. Intellectual life has been polarized. Literary intellectuals versus physical scientists, each mired in mutual dislike and misunderstanding. To the literary scholars, the scientists are self-aggrandizing techno-utopians, ignorant of the social character of modern life. But we got those in the humanities, too. Scientists, literary scholars are trapped in their hermeneutic circles and cower from reality, and I bet if we looked, we could find them in the sciences as well. To Snow, the sciences are intensive, rigorous, constantly in action. He says this culture contains a great deal of argument, usually more rigorous and almost always at a higher conceptual level than literary persons' arguments. I'm a literary scholar, so I feel that one. Even books are of little value, as he cites an exacting and admirable scientist who prefers to use his books as tools. Snow goes on to wonder, what sort of tool would a book make? Perhaps a hammer, a primitive digging instrument. In another 5 years, Snow could have read Seamus Heaney's poem Digging and had another kind of answer, but we'll leave that to the natural Luddites. Science is our future, literary culture is our past. Scientists are morally sound, while literary scholars, literary scholars. Sciences will keep us financially viable, while literature, well, we'll have something to read while we're poor. Snow's arguments about the two cultures is a 1950s version of the straw man arguments we still see today, both from scientists and from humanists. Narratives that seemingly confirm Snow's thesis are abundant in the US. John Horgan of Stevens Institute of Technology tells engineering freshmen, "It is precisely because science is so powerful that we need the humanities now more than ever. In your science, mathematics, and engineering classes, you're given facts, answers, knowledge, truth. Your professors say, this is how things are. They give you certainty. The humanities gives you uncertainty, doubt, and skepticism." This statement typifies the dichotomy between sciences and humanities, science the domain of objective thought, and humanities of the subjective. The value of the humanities in this kind of formulation is that it offers a lens to the sciences. It makes the humanities a handmaiden to the sciences, a phenomenon that Julia Flanders has described as humanities insight masters and subsumes what these technologies have to offer. Here's another genre of response from Carolyn Gregoire in the Huffington Post. Career-specific skills can often be learned on the job, whereas critical thinking and problem-solving skills are invaluable benefits of a humanities education, as demonstrated by the many Wall Street executives who studied the humanities in college. She represents the logical fallacy often present in defenses of the humanities, implying that critical thinking, or indeed problem solving, are of the humanities and not integral parts of the sciences too. And nothing puts the human in humanities like Wall Street executives. I use these examples to mark the kinds of justifications for the humanities that reflect two cultures' logic. Do we ourselves believe that the humanities are so irrelevant that applying them to the sciences or misrepresenting science skills is how we'll stay current? It's like we got to Matthew Arnold, stopped at Sweetness and Light, and then thought, maybe Arnold can tell us something about disaccharides and photons. Or, like humanities scholars are magical unicorns who can actually define critical thinking, and the sciences don't think. We hear echoes of Snow in how we talk about the humanities in comparison to the sciences. Unwinnable competitions with the sciences for funding, the decline in tenure-track jobs in the humanities, the relative employability of our undergrads, and the only answers we can produce are Band-Aids. Grants, alternative paths for PhDs, and skill-driven humanities courses. And as Taylor Swift would say, Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. Among the compelling responses to Snow, critic Lionel Trilling argues that Snow's cultural tribalism impaired the possibility of rational discourse. There's a warning for us there. Will we distort our own practices, view the sciences and humanities in competitive suspicion, and foreclose the rich possibilities at the intersections of the arts and sciences? When Snow revisited his remarks in the 1960s, he seized on the social sciences as an answer, as a third culture, yet that only has the effect of reifying the humanities and science binary. Consider, on the other hand, one of the very few examples I can find that doesn't reflect Snow's logic. This from Gail Houston, English chair at the University of New Mexico. Hard sciences and social sciences depend on metaphor, the stuff of fiction and poetry, Shakespeare and Woolf, to describe abstract algorithms and theories. Such an example pushes back against an arts and sciences divide, but not through caricature. It also recalls an idea frequently observed by digital humanist Willard McCarty, about British computer pioneer Alan Turing, that his mathematical genius was matched only by his capacity for metaphor, and then out of both came modern computing. It's here at the place where the humanities and sciences meet, the digital humanities is in danger of becoming the red herring in the crisis of the humanities. Polemics about the field, usually the most critical ones, position it as a third culture. In doing so, they reinforce the inferiority of the humanities in relation to the STEM fields, that the only role of the humanities is to explain or humanize the sciences, that digital skills will get English and history majors jobs, and that digital humanities is where the money is. They imply that to be a thriving discipline, the humanities needs to be like STEM, instrumental, fundable, and employable. Looking to the model of the sciences to solve the crisis of the humanities, we reify Snow's argument that the engine of knowledge, the agent of change, is the sciences. And to do so is to continue locating the humanities in a subordinate position. Digital humanities does reveal where the sciences and humanities overlap, but it's done disservice by a two cultures narrative, because that suggests that arts and sciences are fundamentally in opposition to each other, and that's the wrong approach. The right one is to consider the relation between the digital and the human, not a fundamental opposition itself. The relation shapes the range of practices subsumed under the broad term digital humanities, including humanities computing, computers and sciences, new media studies, and more. The more sophisticated definitions of the field aren't simply additive, or as Natalia Ciceri has put it, humanities computing plus, but view the constituent dimensions of digital humanities as a way of promoting greater complexity. This is a dynamic present in a definition offered by Kathleen Fitzpatrick. That's actually the current Wikipedia definition of digital humanities. For me, it has to do with the work that gets done at the crossroads of digital media and traditional humanistic study. It's bringing the tools and techniques of digital media to bear on traditional humanistic questions. But it's also bringing humanistic modes of inquiry to bear on digital media. It's a sort of moving back and forth across those lines, thinking about what computing is, how it functions in our culture, and using those computing technologies to think about the more traditional aspects of culture. If we view humanities as a lens to interpret the sciences alone, humanists will always be inferior to scientists, and the scientists aren't out there worrying about the superiority of the humanities. Digital humanities is not a false hope for empirical value in the humanities or a pseudoscience, but a set of practices that articulate a complex relationship between experiment and interpretation. Indeed, HASTAC and For Humanities are examples of the rich possibilities of the digital humanities. I will say more about HASTAC later, but For Humanities, co-founded by Alan Liu, Melissa Terrace, and Jeffrey Rockwell, describes its mission as follows. The humanities contribute the needed perspective, training in complex human phenomena and communication skills needed to spark, understand, and make human new discoveries. In the process, they themselves discover new and also very old ways to be human. They do so through their unique contribution of the wisdom of the past, awareness of other cultures in the present, and imagination of innovative and fair futures. This is not half-hearted science or the two cultures at work. Rather, it, like Fitzpatrick's definition, marks flexible movement across the boundaries of humanities and science practices and pushes back against disciplinary isolation, as Scott Weingart put it, that has currency within the academy. Yet, Snow's work does have insight for understanding the digital humanities, both in its emergence in the US and the challenges of the global digital humanities. Snow's claims are linked to a particular form of imperialism, the Cold War. Snow saw in scientists a stronghold against communism. He believed that sciences could be taken abroad to industrialize the developing world and solve inequality gaps. Indeed, during the last half of the 20th century, the Cold War situated strategies of engagement and funded scientific research. That is to say, the engine driving technology and innovation was the imperial battle for world domination by the US and the USSR. As Willard McCarty has argued, the Cold War is an important context for understanding humanities computing, one of the precursors to digital humanities. The otherness of the Soviet Union was accompanied by what he calls the uncanny otherness of computing. For McCarty, the Cold War is the defining context of computing in its infancy, and by extension, it's one defining context for humanities computing. He attributes the marginality of humanities computing and its alienation from mainstream humanities in part to Cold War computing, the real or imagined mainframe systems that were other to most humanists because they were physically, culturally alien, and obviously complicit with social disruption and militarization. He cites English philosopher Anthony Kenny's speculation that humanities scholars turned away from computing and towards critical theory because of a fear of quantification. As McCarty notes, the end of the Cold War coincided with the public release of the web in 1991. And despite its publicness and openness, the web did little to stir the passions of mainstream humanities. That is until the emergence of digital humanities in the mid-2000s. So why digital humanities now? There are any number of good answers, like the job market, or the social dimensions of Web 2.0 that are transforming scholarly practices, that we have access to graphical user interfaces, that content management systems mean we don't have to hand code every page from scratch. Another striking dimension, as yet unexplored, is that just as humanities computing came up during the Cold War, the heyday of the digital humanities has coincided with the Long War, the name given to the war on terror by US military leaders. This war has brought with it untold technological terrors, armed drone warfare, the PRISM surveillance system, automatic biometric systems, backscatter X-ray technology at the airports. The technology of warfare is pitted against the threat of radical Islam, even in an age where bin Laden had a bookshelf. And I think my next digital humanities project is in bin Laden's bookshelf. So if anybody wants to collaborate, I'm actually serious. I took a look at it today, it's like fun. While Cold War technology seems to have made humanities scholars run in the other direction, recently humanities scholars have been running towards digital humanities. Why? Perhaps the ubiquity, convenience, and user-friendliness of computer technology and digital media have transformed Cold War fear into the Long War's morbid curiosity. After all, using one's thumbprint to unlock a phone may make biometric technology seem less distressing. Or perhaps humanities scholars are resigned to big data. Or more optimistically, perhaps the access to forms of knowledge that have been made possible online offer hope for pushing back against the horrors of the age when we think about WikiLeaks and the possibilities of blogs and Twitter. In light of these conditions, digital humanities holds perhaps the elusive promise of both understanding and mastery of the technological means of production, a victory, however small, in the face of a technological environment driven by omnipresent war. Here's where Fitzpatrick's definition and the For Humanities mission are again revealing. We can use tools to ask humanistic questions. We can use humanistic inquiry to understand computation and digital technologies, but we use these answers to inform one another. And only through the interoperability of these practices can we better understand both the humanities and technology. So why did I just take you on a strange trip from humanities computing to digital humanities through the Cold War and the Long War? It's to illustrate unavoidable links between imperialism and the field's trajectory in the US. And I am a postcolonialist after all. In doing so, I illustrate the way the digital humanities already exists within a matrix of humanities and sciences, East and West, global North and global South. I've repeatedly insisted that I'm speaking from a US context for the digital humanities to emphasize that what this matrix looks like is fluid, shifting in relation to a complex interplay between history, technology, power, access, all of which varies in national and regional contexts. You may remember this bumper sticker from the 90s, think globally, act locally. Indeed, it's the slogan for CUNY Connect and gets used in an array of industries and is something of the catchphrase of the globalized era. This is the idea I was getting at the Digital Humanities 2014 conference in Lausanne, where I proposed that digital humanities might use the framework of an accent to negotiate the difference in practices around the world. Spoken language has accents, written language has accents, we all have accents, and digital humanities has accents too. They're present in the practices, theories, and preferences for the field that look different and are informed by local context. To invoke the concept of accent is to decenter a hegemonic definition or expectation of digital humanities scholarly practice. It gives us a framework to move beyond the tedious task of defining digital humanities, to fully appreciate both the affordances and challenges to doing digital humanities around the world. It's the challenge to move from a logic like this one, which centers the US and the UK and Canada in digital humanities, to embracing the diversity of practices around the world, as represented in the Around DH in 80 Days project. As Alex Gill, who was the driving force behind Around DH, wrote recently, the US is very provincial in these matters. I have perhaps ad nauseum situated the US-edness of my analysis to emphasize that it's only in relation to local context that we are able to be reflective about our practices. My experience of being within the US Academy is that it's very easy to center US practices through our viewpoint of the major projects, debates, and institutions within the US. And this speaks to why we can't situate the field as a resolution to a humanities versus sciences dichotomy. We'll be reduced to reconciling a divide and nothing more, and obscure the longer relationships between the history of humanities and technology and its multiple dimensions around the world. Perhaps you're familiar with the Rudyard Kipling line I quoted at the beginning of my talk, "East is east, west is west, and never the twain shall meet." This quote is often held up as a signifier of a fundamental difference between East and West, of both epistemological and ontological differences that render each unknowable to each other. Like Snow's Two Cultures does to the arts and sciences, Kipling's quote seems to reify the monolithic natures of East and West. Yet what many people familiar with Kipling's line don't know is that in the poem, the twain actually do meet. An Afghan warrior and a British colonel decide they have something in common after all. Imagine that. As Kipling's work indicates, it's not only the sciences that are shaped by imperialism, so too are the humanities. Therefore, global digital humanities is not only a place where humanists and scientists can meet, but also where today's instantiation of East and West, the global North and global South meet too. Implied in this meeting are presumptions of difference, of commonality, of suspicion, of troubling power dynamics. But these are the challenges of the global digital humanities, of negotiating across not only two imperial cultures, but the hegemony of Anglo-American digital humanities. Having had the chance to read really widely in the digital humanities scholarship around the world, what's striking is that the Anglo-American context and its scholarship are taken as the digital humanities. Anyone who saw Stacy Stutzman's excellent poster presentation yesterday that analyzes DH syllabi, this is one of the graphs from her blog, may not be surprised to learn that the names we see so often on US DH syllabi are the same ones being cited over and over in DH scholarship around the world. This is problematic because the trajectory of digital humanities in the US is necessarily different from those in other places. Granted, this is not an issue unique to digital humanities and relevant to the ways that theoretical constructs of the global North have overdetermined knowledge production around the world. This is a sign for the ongoing need for locally situated scholarship and indigenous frameworks to theorize questions of the digital. Otherwise, the US and indeed the UK and Canada, in the context of the digital humanities, may subsume the rest of the world in its ambit. Like the crisis of the humanities, perhaps digital humanities scholarship is another one of the US's biggest exports. I'm reminded of a provocative statement offered by Padmini Murray Ray at the Digital Diversity Conference earlier this month. Your DH is not my DH. It's an important reminder that the debates, practices, and shape of the digital humanities in other countries and contexts, and in her case, India, is not the same as it is in the US. Here are a few examples to illustrate the reasons why Anglo-American digital humanities scholarship is of limited use around the world. Indian digital humanities is inflected by the troubling history of science and technology in India and the strength of the IT sector there. Moreover, the education system is more closely aligned with the British and is more highly segregated between arts and sciences, so actually curricularizing the digital humanities is a challenge. Despite strong impulses towards archiving in Indian digital humanities, there's underrepresentation in local languages because optical character recognition does not account for them. Here's where the ability to critique building, which is often taken for granted in a US context, is an unaffordable luxury elsewhere. Building new tools to account for these languages is crucial to cultural preservation. Indeed, a critique of tools, even if we are aware of the way they're problematic, particularly when we think about representing race, class, gender, and intersectionality, is a privilege of English speakers who can use existing tools. Another challenge is the number of different scripts in the country. In a country that has 122 major languages and 1,599 other languages, how do you deal with that within archives? In one language, Kashmiri, which is the one my family and I speak, there are 3 different scripts, depending on occasion and region and purpose. So I'm not sure how one OCRs that. In South Korea, despite massive government investment in digitizing information and digital cultural heritage, digital humanities has failed to gain currency. Javier Cha argues that this stems from a digital and humanities divide that comes from the fact that in the 1960s and 1970s, during the transition to post-industrial economy, the humanists were left out. So even though the humanities scholars are using digital archives for their research, they really don't imagine that there is a digital component to what they do. In Nigeria, as scholar Sayan Oyewoso has noted, language preservation is an area in which the digital humanities might intervene, but it's only possible to do so by combining information and communication technology with humanities in the context of local languages. Such an approach requires the owning and appropriating of technology locally to ensure it's not seen by scholars as belonging to foreign people and foreign cultures, but instead to scholars within Nigeria. South Africa's National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences has been collaborating with the Council for Development in Social Science Research in Africa, seeking to strengthen South-to-South collaborations on the continent. Digital humanities through blogs, wikis, microblogging, podcasts, social networks, open learning, resources, and web conferencing is making this possible. South African scholars Johannes Smit and Denzel Chetty argue that the printed word created isolation for African scholars, but digital humanities bridges that gap, not only with the rest of the world, but also among African scholars on the continent. It may not be my place to point out that South Africa has a unique postcolonial history in relation to other countries in Africa, and for South Africans to evoke Pan-Africanist rhetoric can be very problematic. However, Dorothy Odarte Wellington spoke to this idea yesterday at the African and African Descendant Culture panel when she described Western Sahara literature as born digital, and that's a factor of the Moroccan colonization that replaced the Spanish. What I'm describing are not only scholarly practices, but also survival practices. The ability to produce digital cultural heritage is a matter of epistemic survival. Within colonized or formerly colonized nations, access to means of production, to cultural production that is, has been a way of reshaping dynamics of cultural power, of claiming a humanity denied, of retelling stories told about them, and in doing so, pushing back against the dynamic that Karl Marx articulates in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. At MLA this year, Alex Gill reminded us that access to representation in the US is not simply a matter of have and have not. For people who are undocumented and whose survival requires living in the shadows, there isn't the same kind of access. Anne-Marie Perez raised a similar issue at the DH Limits panel this morning when talking about what it means to ask students to write in public. Being public about identities can be a dangerous act. And it's also sometimes a literal matter of life and death. On the shuttle from Lansing Airport, I met Rachel Wexelbaum, who's here at this conference. She's an active Wikipedia edit-a-thon organizer who described the situation of LGBT Wikipedians in Azerbaijan who were tortured and kidnapped because they were editing Wikipedia. So these really are matters of figurative and literal forms of survival. Indeed, the digital divides that exist in the world do so unevenly. The local contexts matter and are inflected by linguistic, cultural, and social dimensions. Each location and even local communities within national contexts are uniquely constituted beyond binaries like East or West, and their practices move beyond the humanities and sciences. It's only by defining and situating these contexts and the digital humanities practices that exist within them that we can understand what digital humanities looks like at both the local and the global scales. That is to say, and my apologies if this sounds tautological, digital humanities is defined only by mapping its practices. Indeed, at the global scale, we find resonance for Matthew Kirschenbaum's evocation of Stuart Hall's floating signifier for Hall of Race and for Kirschenbaum Digital Humanities to encompass the range of practices that constitute the field. To think globally and to act locally in practice is to foreground the particular over the universal, to make fewer general and more nuanced claims about the humanities and the sciences in the 21st century, and to reveal the range of possibilities enabled by digital humanities. But lest you think I'm going to end there on a negative note, I want to suggest that what we've witnessed over the past few days at this conference and online through the HASTAC website, as we learned yesterday from Kathy Davidson, the world's oldest academic social network, this is the present and the future of digital humanities, and not simply in the US. Yesterday, Dean Rehberger, director of Matrix here at MSU, observed that the diversity of this conference was remarkable for the digital humanities. Indeed, it's remarkable for the not digital humanities. We have seen here the wide range of affiliations of people who've made it to this conference. We see it in the range of panels and posters, African descendant cultures in the digital age, which spoke to how ethnically diverse communities are adapting digital tools for their own cultural dynamics. Women of color feminisms and digital production pedagogy, which explored concepts and strategies for incorporating women of color feminism and digital production into teaching. Cezanne Charles and John Marshall's tremendous keynote on their art that explored the social and technical imaginary. The list goes on. The HASTAC and Computers and Writing crossover dialogue, learning with and in technology, local challenges in the globalized digital era, feminist and embodied perspectives on social media and social justice. This is really one of the few places that I think you will get all of those kinds of talks on one schedule. The evidence that Snow has it wrong is right here in this room. Here we find the hope for scholarly practitioners whose rich conversations move beyond binaries of arts and sciences, East and West, who can make thinking globally and acting locally a real possibility. We can be the ones who disavow Snow's logical fallacies and remember that in Kipling, the twain really do meet in complicated ways, inflected by imperial dynamics. We can be the ones who situate our work in the complex matrices of power, knowledge, and locality. We can't solve the crisis of the humanities, and I'm increasingly convinced it's not meant to be solved. But perhaps we can reclaim Burton's banished muses, not for those in whose hands political power is concentrated, but for our own communities in their many dimensions. And in doing so, we might be the ones who instantiate a new heroical age for scholarship in the 21st century. Thank you.
We have
So,
time for
questions?
questions, plenty of time for questions, so if you have one. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. And as the first questioner, let me just thank you for a wonderful and provocative plenary. I really particularly liked how you connected the emergence of digital humanities and the long war. And I will ask you a question that Mike Widener from Stanford asked a few years ago of all of us, which was that basically why aren't digital humanists doing what we keep saying we should be perfectly situated to be doing, which is actually critiquing this long war and speaking intelligently to it. And you brought this up as well, that we are in a place, perhaps an outcome of it, but also hopefully if we're critical and good scholarly citizens, should be the ones who are also critical of it because of that birth. So can you speak to that, perhaps where the voices are?
Absolutely. I don't think they're not really present in the scholarly community in the way we would like them to, I think. In some ways, even though, depending on how you want to trace it, digital humanities has a really long history, I think at least the way that it's shaped in the US has been so focused on a particular form of literary scholarship that really replicates a lot of the power dynamics of print scholarship. So when you look at the kinds of archives that exist and that are the most well-developed or the best funded, Blake, Whitman, I mean, these aren't, I don't know, the Toni Morrison archive. It's not, there's a lot of a rehearsing of the same kinds of value and prestige economies in terms of textuality and canonicity that we find. And so I think that because a lot of the work in the US has been focused on the literary dimension of humanities computing, I think just in the way that people who study that form of scholarship in an analog context may not necessarily feel like it's their responsibility to be advocating or activists in that sense. But I mean, I do hope that's changing. I think when we look at the ways that scholars, people here are thinking about social media and activist pedagogy, that these are the people who are best positioned to really be making those critiques. But there's also, I think, there's fatigue. I mean, especially when you work around social justice issues, you can feel the pressure that you have to sort of account for everything. That if you were thinking about race and gender, well, what else is being left out? One person or the 15 people who are working on these issues can't be responsible or just logistically can't manage to serve every kind of constituency that needs people working on its behalf. So I mean, I think that there's a combination there, but I think in the last 5 years we've seen a stronger shift towards thinking in relation to new media scholarship and some of the work that's been going on there. So I hope that greater engagement with that scholarship will sort of improve that front within digital humanities.
Hey, Roopika, I really enjoyed that talk. Thank you so much. And I really like the way you were historicizing the two cultures debates. And when you were making, when you were drawing out some of that history, I was thinking of the debates in the 80s, the 1880s between Huxley and Arnold. And if I remember correctly, in those debates, neither of them is interested in touching technology. So for Arnold, it's what the lower class do because they work with their hands. It's not of the mind. And for the science, technology is just the means, right? So it's something you delegate to the working class, for example. So I'm thinking about this in terms of digital humanities as service, right? So is there a way of taking that part of history of like technology? I don't know if it's a between state or it's just something neither of them really want to privilege as a space of knowing or learning or education. What can we learn from that in talking today about the way, again, that digital humanities is often rendered as service, especially as a contingent service, right? One that might have a short shelf life or one that is merely technical.
So can I just ask you to clarify a little bit about, are you interested in the Arnold Huxley more so, or sort of the relationship between service and technology in terms of, because that's been discussed a lot in digital humanities scholarship. Yeah. So I'm just curious about what particular dimension that interests you.
Well, I like how you historicized it, and I have never really thought of it in those terms. And so I guess what I'm asking is the way in which often DH is understood as is something that you can delegate to technicians on campus, or you can delegate to contingent positions that can then be, a service provided by them. How we might intervene at that level. So how do you say, look, Arnold and Huxley maybe had it all wrong. They ignored actually the value of technology in both of these areas, and that might actually be a way of creating a bridge to talk about, say, technology as labor. So I don't know. It was really just I was just thinking about, especially when you talked about, DH as an export. It really resonated, and I'm like, then you can really think of it as a service dimension, and how to, I would assume work against that.
Right, because when we think about the kinds of positions that we see coming out as jobs, and we just saw one at Northeastern for a 2-year data visualization specialist, that I think that there's a tension there between, on the one hand, the way that the alt-act job market has really reshaped the kinds of possibilities that people who are engaged in doing this kind of work can go after. But on the other hand, I think, people talk about tenure track versus adjunct in terms of categories, but I think if we look at the digital humanities, we see a proliferation of these different kinds of roles, and particularly service roles, that maybe we need to theorize some more and really think about the ethical dimensions of that. It's interesting, though, when you mention the Arnold Huxley, because if they're sort of thinking about, it seems like there's a parallel dynamic between who are the people on which you can sort of put off that labor, and particularly also we might want to ask what's the role of the kind of grant machine in funding particular kinds of short-term and contingent forms of labor. So I think there is a really interesting parallel.
I really appreciated your talk, especially its nuanced attention to matrices of power in relationship to the digital humanities, and the focus on accent, which I think about in terms of dialects and hierarchies of value. The conversation has made me think about and want to ask you to reflect on decolonial approaches even within university environments where different established disciplines are recolonizing. Mm-hmm. And so what might be the role of digital humanities research, scholarship, intervention in that? And part of it, in a way, links to the last question, and thinking about as that recolonization happens within the academy of kind of old disciplinary boundaries, there's more than this. Doing digital humanities work is more labor for less money. Yeah. So that's been on my mind constantly throughout the conference, how to do this work and have it not just relegated to service in that way, how to do the work and fund it not only across just the issues of access, both access to do it and access to the technology and resources to do it and do it well.
Thank you for your question. I think there's several different threads. The first thing that immediately came to mind was actually Dhanashree Thorat's talk, which actually, I think you were there, Renee, at the DH Limits panel this morning, and Dhanashree talked very compellingly about how archives are formed in particular ways. She talked about the September 11th archive and how that reflects particular forms of consolidating U.S. national identity and positioning Muslims in relation to that. And one of the questions that came up was, what are the kind of examples of alternative archives that do a kind of decentering of dominant narratives effectively? And so we talked about that a little bit in our Q&A session, because what ends up happening, if you want to create an archive, and it's sort of even just to get it started, right? It's your labor, it's your volunteer labor, it's your effective labor, depending on what kind of institution you're at, it may not be recognized in tenure and promotion. And, is that service? I mean, to me, that's scholarship. And so the challenge there is, how do we make this legible as scholarship in an age which, as you're suggesting, seems to be getting a lot more conservative about our practices. But I think there's a tension between, on the one hand, a kind of retrenchment that we might see underway, and also the fact that a lot of departments have been looking to hire digital humanities scholars. And it's something I actually wrote a blog post about probably the year before last, looking at what was actually happening on the MLA job list. And it was interesting because when people talk about digital humanities, we often talk about, oh, that's where the jobs really are. But then when you actually look at what's happening on the MLA job information list, people rarely want to actually hire somebody to just digital humanities. They're usually asking for someone who has often a very canonical focus, but who has a secondary specialization. And I think that's a way that they often rationalize between the tension between older forms of scholarship and sort of wanting to embrace the digital. But then this is being live streamed, right? Okay, so when I was on the job market, I had an interview for a job that nobody in this room works at this institution, I'm sure. And so it was sort of very clear to me, it was actually a DH job, and it was very clear to me that the faculty who were interviewing me just had no idea what digital humanities was. And not in a bad way, but it was awkward because, trying to sort of talk about what you do without presuming they don't know what you're talking about, but they really don't know what you're talking about. So it's a challenge. And so, I think that that's a huge dynamic. There's a lot of education work that has to be done on our part. In my situation, actually, a big draw of my job is that we write our narratives for tenure and promotion and for reappointment and get reappointed every year. And so I'm actually the first person to get their digital scholarship to count as scholarship at my university. And because when I went to the union said, "What are you talking about?" They said, "What's digital scholarship?" So it was really that dire situation. But we then unfortunately have to take on that additional burden of making what we do legible.
Hi. My question is, you mentioned, I'm going to try to articulate this as quickly and as clearly as I can. I was really struck by what you mentioned about Turing's simultaneous mastery of metaphor and mechanism, and the mathematical underpinning of computing. And I was similarly struck by the argument you made about the disproportional access to, definition of tools in the digital humanities, and the sort of the Anglo-centric nature of how these tools are conceived, created, distributed, available. Do you think that, and I'm sure this is taking place already, so I don't mean to derogate by assuming this is not happening. But do you think there's a role for decolonization, for decentering a European, Western, Anglo narrative by providing a means of employing metaphors from outside Anglo-Western culture to shape how we understand these tools at more fundamental levels? Is there some approach that can be taken to increase the receptivity of how these metaphors are employed to engage with other cultural sources so that it becomes a richer tool set at its base?
That's an interesting question because it reminds me of the Poetry for Robots project out of Arizona State. It's Arizona State, right? Yeah. They're working, their knowledge lab, science lab, whose name escapes me at the moment, have created this project called Poetry for Robots. And so you can go to their website and you land on a page, and the page has a lot of preset images, and you select an image, and then they ask you to write a poem for the image. And it's only 50 to 120 characters, something like that. And so what they're hoping to show when they can look at the results of this poetry is sort of what it means to feed metaphors into an algorithm and what kind of search possibilities that and how does that change how search happens. And what's interesting about that is because of the audience for a project like that is very limited. I mean, even though it's online, we can't presume that it's necessarily going to attract people bringing their own kind of metaphors from different cultures into it, or maybe it will, but it doesn't track that. And so that's sort of an interesting dimension, is that how do we even know whether that is happening if we're not looking for it? And maybe we need to start looking for it.
Are we ready to say thank you to Roopika?
Thank you.